This podcast may contain explicit language. Welcome to the Greatest Movie of All Time podcast, the show that uses a unique grading style to redefine what the greatest movies are. I'm Tom Duncan.
And I'm Dana Duncan.
We also welcome back our returning celebrity guest, a member of the Five Timers Club with previous appearances on Inglourious Bastards, Zodiac, My Fair Lady, The Artist, The Great Dictator, and Forrest Gump. Please welcome back Sarah Duncan.
Good to be back, Tom.
Michael Buffer, I don't think I am, but oh well. We also welcome our newest celebrity guest, film critic for both the Georgia and Atlanta Film Critics, creator and host of the Sonic Cinema podcast. Please welcome Brian Skutle.
Thank you very much, Thomas. It's good to be here.
Welcome, welcome. And as a first-time guest, you are subject to our new guest questions. So, first one up, tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do, and why you love movies.
In addition to the Sonic Cinema podcast, that is an offshoot of my website, Sonic Cinema, where I write film reviews, I write film blogs. I also house a lot of my original musical compositions, as well as fan commentaries that some friends of mine and I did about 20 years ago or so. We did that for a long time, and as podcasts were starting to get more and more popular, just made more sense to transition into actually doing podcasts. And that's been going on for about 10 years now. So for my job, I was a movie theater manager for a long time. In the past couple of years, I've transitioned to doing maintenance for movie projectors, but keep going on Sonic Cinema, watching as much as I can, both new and old. One thing that you'll find about the Sonic Cinema podcast is that I tend to focus more on the past as well. We occasionally touch on recent movies, but mostly it's about talking about the classics, or at least movies from a different era, putting them in context of that era and what makes them so special. And that goes for films and filmmakers. So that's pretty much boils down what Sonic Cinema does.
And you will definitely find kindred spirits on this podcast for historical movies, as we don't discuss anything within the last 5 years. So, the dreaded question number 2. What is your favorite movie and why?
There are a couple of different answers to this. One that's a little bit more contemporary than the other. I'm going to go with the classic one, though. It is Buster Keaton's Sherlock Jr. I watched it about 25 years ago off of AMC, back when they were showing movies on a regular basis, before Turner Classic Movies really kind of exerted itself when it came to classic movies. And I just love the imagination. I love the invention of what Keaton does in that film. And it's about movie projectionists. So that has a special meaning to me because I did work in projection for a long time.
Excellent. Finally, what makes a good movie for you?
That type of question, it depends a lot on the type of movie that we're talking about. Strong characters and story are obviously at the forefront of what makes a good movie, let alone what makes a great movie. If a movie is a little bit more dramatic or more, I guess, is trying to present the real world, how authentically does it present the real world? Does it stay true to the characters? Does it stay true to the idea? When it comes to fantasy, science fiction, what type of world is it creating? How does it create that world through sound, through images? And then what do the ideas say about humanity? I think that's always an important thing. And then, of course, there's the subjective reaction. Does it entertain us? Is it some? If it's a comedy, does it make us laugh? Is it if it's a horror movie, does it scare us? If it's a drama, does it make us cry? And if it's supposed to do those things, how well does it do it? I mean, honestly, there's so many different answers to that question. It really just depends on the type of movie we're talking about.
Well, that takes us right into tonight's film. For our 235th episode, we discuss Mr. Smith Goes to Washington for its 85th anniversary. Directed by Frank Capra, written by Sidney Buckman and Miles Connolly. Music by Dmitri Tiomkin. Starring Jean Arthur as Saunders, James Stewart as Jefferson Smith, Claude Rains as Senator Joseph Payne, Edward Arnold as Jim Taylor, Guy Kibbe as Governor Hopper, Thomas Mitchell as Diz Moore, Eugene Pallett as Chick McGann, Beulah Bondi as Ma Smith, H.B. Warner as Senate Majority Leader Agnew, Harry Carey as President of the Senate, and Astrid Alwyn as Susan Payne. Recognition for this movie? Mr. Smith Goes to Washington premiered on October 17th, 1939. It became the second highest grossing film of 1939. It was also the third highest grossing film of the 1930s decade, only behind Gone with the Wind and Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. The film was nominated for 11 Oscars for Best Picture, Director for Frank Capra, Actor for James Stewart, Screenplay for Sidney Buckman, Supporting Actor for Harry Carey and Claude Rains, Art Direction, Film Editing, Score, and Sound Recording, winning for Original Story for Lewis R. Foster, where apparently Screenplay and the story were separated as different categories as opposed to original versus adapted, because the winner of the Screenplay Award was the guy who wrote Gone with the Wind. I don't know. Odd. The American Film Institute has recognized this on the following lists. In 1998, it was number 29 on its 100 Years, 100 Movies list. In 2003, for AFI's 100 Years, 100 Heroes and Villains, Jefferson Smith clocked in at the number 11 hero. In 2006, for 100 Years, 100 Cheers, this clocked in at the number 5 slot. And for the redo version of 2007, AFI's 100 Years, 100 Movies 10th Anniversary Edition, this was number 26. In 1989, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington was added to the United States National Film Registry as one of the initial 25 inductees. Can you name any other ones on that list?
I want to say the original Star Wars was there.
Okay. I don't believe it was.
Gone with the Wind?
I believe Gone with the Wind was one of the first 25 entries. Correct.
Singing in the Rain?
Yes. And you were correct, Brian. Star Wars was on, so my bad.
The Wizard of Oz?
Yes. Vertigo, Sunset Boulevard, Sunrise, which we've discussed on this show, Some Like It Hot, Snow White, the aforementioned Snow White, The Searchers on the Waterfront, Nanook of the North, Modern Times, The Maltese Falcon, which we discussed earlier this year, The Learning Tree, Intolerance, High Noon, Grapes of Wrath, The General, Dr. Strangelove, The Crowd, Citizen Kane, Casablanca, and The Best Years of Our Lives.
So one Chaplin and one Harold Lloyd. But
And
no
one
Buster
Keaton.
Which one was
Yeah.
Keaton?
General.
The General. Okay, yeah. Okay, my mistake. So, okay, interesting.
Anyway, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington currently holds a 97% among critics on Rotten Tomatoes, a 73 score on Metacritic, and a 4.1 out of 5 on Letterboxd. So, new question. For our two guests here, we'll start with Sarah, but why Mr. Smith Goes to Washington? You were the first to choose this episode.
I had some sort of I've seen clips of it my entire life, basically. And I've always been a big Jimmy Stewart fan, but I really did enjoy watching this movie. I think this is, if I'm not mistaken, this is one of the ones we watched in 2020, but it could have been in the months after as well. But I just enjoyed this movie, especially because I watched it at a time where, politics were reflecting things that I didn't necessarily think were right. And I just think it had something to say yet.
So to be fair, this episode that we're recording today will come out the day after the election this year. Part of the synergy, if you will. Next week's episode, we're recording the day after the election, and that's Fight Club. So that was good planning on my part. But Brian, you also chose to be on this episode. Why Mr. Smith?
Well, like Sarah, I mean, I saw this much earlier. I saw it in I think about 2003, 2004, which was, I mean, honestly, it feels like the entire 21st century has just been almost unprecedented political times. And in terms of possible corruption, when it comes to optimism versus pessimism about the political system. And I mean, this movie just really connected with me. It's a movie that I go back to every few years, and it's one of those things where I just enjoy watching this movie, and it fits that Capra mold of being optimistic even when it's showing us negative aspects of society that we're seeing. And it's just a movie that I go back to time and time again to almost be inspired by, really, when it comes to good versus bad, good versus evil, however you want to put it. It's a movie I love going back to, and I love talking about.
So we've kind of already visited on the relationship that both of our guests have to this movie, but Dad, what is your relationship to this film?
I can't remember the first time I watched it. I think this is about the fourth or fifth time I've seen the film. It was one I know that my dad always mentioned, but never really was on very often on network TV or even anything else until they started having the classic movies. So I had never seen it, but boy, I'll bet you it was late 90s when I first saw it. Probably about the time American or AMC was doing classic films before Turner really got going. And I'm pretty sure that's where I would have seen it.
As far as my personal relationship with it, I don't remember when I first saw it. My guess is around college that I caught up with this movie. I don't know where it was or in what context. I just know I had seen it. But it's, as Sarah mentioned or alluded to before, it's a movie that I've watched a couple of times recently, not just for this show. I think I showed Allison the film maybe last year or something. I can't remember. There was another time recently that I had it on for somebody else that I was introducing the film to. So I think I've seen it probably once every 2 years or so, going back a few years at this point. And I will say that every time I watch it, I change my opinion on it. And it may be just the kind of mood that I'm particularly in. So the first time I remember seeing it, I was impressed by the film, just generally, not knowing what was going on. The second time I kind of went through it, at least recently, I thought, boy, this movie's really outdated. And it doesn't entertain the flair for what current politics is. And this last time, there's such a innocence and wholesomeness that's from this era of film. So when we were on the 1942 Revisionist Almanac episode, Dad, I had mentioned that a lot of those films were very wholesome. It's this era of film that you feel like you could easily watch these with your grandparents because this is from their generation, but there's nothing really ill classic unless it's commenting on racial stereotypes, really.
Yeah.
And this movie kind of steers away from a lot of that, other than the fact that Congress is made up solely of men, but, that was reflective of the time.
And white men.
Well, yeah. So what is the film actually about?
I feel like from a thematic standpoint, this is about if a normal person, if a regular person, if a regular Joe got into Congress, what would their experience be like? Would they be seen as one of the exclusive members of a club, or would they be seen as an outsider? And it's very clear from the outset, for a lot of various reasons, that Jefferson Smith is an outsider. And what type of impact would he have on the system now that he's on the inside? And he's starting to see that the system is inherently corrupt, and he tries to combat that. And I mean, it's very much a David and Goliath story, and with obviously Jefferson Smith is David, and then Goliath being the political system in place at the moment.
Yeah, I would also recognize that it's somewhat of a fish out of water structure. You bring a complete novice who, while he has respect and honor for the system itself and its founding principles, in actual practice finds it to be rather detestable, which I think for the most part, if you've taken basic civic courses in like grade school, high school, college, those that have a certain level of education or fervor for this all accept that the principles upon which the country was founded are righteous in nature. However, I think collectively on the flip side of this, they all feel that the Taylors, the Paynes, the rest of it are the thing that destroys everything. And that's why Washington feels like such a viper's den comparatively, and why we have the difference between the outsider candidate or the one who has spent all this time in Washington. They don't understand the people. They've never been, well, maybe some of that's true. Some of it might be false. I don't know if this film shows a great deal of nuance to politics, but it is very idealistic in a way that probably only of the era Frank Capra could do.
I think personally it's much broader than just that. I think to take a line from the movie, this is about the fact that basically any man can make a difference. And it's pushing that on a crowd in like a very poignant time in history, basically saying that you can change all of these problems and you can assist and you can do more than you think you can, and lost causes aren't always lost. I think it says a lot too that in the time after the film was made, they actually had boycotts of the film because they thought it was an attack on democracy, to basically just say that we need to hold people accountable and we can be doing better as well.
From my point of view, this is the same as what we learned earlier in that same decade, the 1930s, about democracy, which is capitalism unregulated will eat itself. And so you have to have regulations in place to prevent that. And the same goes here, which I think is a part of what's being said, which is you either have to rely for democracy to work in the better angels of ourselves, our political philosophy, our political culture, or we have to have regulations to prohibit certain activities. Because otherwise, a rich person has the ability to sway public opinion, has the ability to manipulate and buy politicians, and can effectuate or use democracy for their own selfish purposes.
So is the movie outdated, though?
I go back and forth on that question. I think there are a lot of things that are outdated about it. I mean, obviously, the fact that the Senate is made up entirely of men, and especially made up entirely of white men, obviously, that's very much of the time. It feels like it's much more, the mechanisms with which those take place now are obviously much more complex and a little bit more opaque when it comes to corruption, when it comes to bribing politicians or buying politicians, swaying public opinion through media. We certainly have a much different relationship with that now than in 1939. Do people want the regular person to be representing us in politics? That's, you know, I think that's a question that is, it's hard to answer now, I think, to a certain extent.
I've always found the notion of voting for the person you feel you could have a beer with was kind of foolish. I mean, this is essentially a job interview, and we don't treat it as such. We treat it as a popularity contest instead of who's the most capable and most qualified person to actually do the job. So to me, you know, that we've kind of debased ourselves on who we actually vote for, and there is at least a reasonable argument to be made to reinstate at this time the senators were still directly appointed as opposed to directly elected. So that's a major change. We also had 4 more senators because 2 states were not yet admitted to the Union in this movie. And we had another full World War. We've since seen America become the number 1 superpower, if you will. So there are a lot of things that I think, if you really think about them a little bit, are very outdated about this movie. Also, the filibuster has massively changed.
Well, the simplicity of the scandal.
Sure.
Okay. It would have had to have been much more involved. There would have been special prosecutors. There would have been all. I mean,
you say that, but Watergate was really not that involved.
I understand, but the cover-up was a little bit more than that. So, yes.
I mean, was it? I think the investigation into the cover-up was much more involved.
Tell the CIA or have the CIA tell the FBI to stay away. That was the cover-up.
I mean, it's no JFK assassination. So, Dad, are you ready for a little bit more background on the film? Do you want to give us our plot summary?
All right. Mr. Smith Goes to Washington is a classic tale of idealism, clashing with the gritty realities of political power. Jimmy Stewart stars as Jefferson Smith, a naive but well-intentioned small-town man thrust into the unforgiving world of Washington politics after being unexpectedly appointed to the U.S. Senate. Smith, with his earnest love for American principles, soon finds himself entangled in a web of corruption and power play, where his sincere belief in doing the right thing is dismissed as foolish by hardened senators. What follows is a story of resilience, where Stewart's character battles not only for a cause, but for his very soul. Director Frank Capra lets his protagonist shine during a famous filibuster scene, in which Stewart's quivering intensity speaks volumes about the weight of standing up to corruption. While Capra's romanticized view of democracy is apparent, he tempers it with a frankness about the ugliness of the political machine, a balance that resonates even decades later. It's a movie as much about Smith's journey as it is about a society's idealism and its power to confront and perhaps even mend itself.
Thank you. Did you know? The screenplay was originally purchased by Columbia as a vehicle for Ralph Bellamy, with Harold Wilson slated to produce. Once Frank Capra became the director, the project, planned as a sequel to Mr. Deeds Goes to Town, was entitled Mr. Deeds Goes to Washington, and it was to star Gary Cooper, reprising his role as Longfellow Deeds. Cooper was unavailable for the role, however, and James Stewart was borrowed from MGM. Quote, "I knew he would make a hell of a Mr. Smith," Capra said. "He looked like the country kid The Idealist. It was very close to him. Did you know? In 1942, when a ban on American films was imposed in German-occupied France, the title theaters chose Mr. Smith Goes to Washington for their last movie before the ban went into effect. One Paris theater reportedly screened the film nonstop for 30 days prior to the ban. Did you know? According to the New York Times, the Boy Scouts of America objected to having any part in Mr. Capra's reform movement, and Frank Capra therefore had to use the fictitious name of the Boy Rangers. Boy, yet another great decision by the Boy Scouts. Did you know? The Washington Press Corps was highly indignant at the way it was portrayed in the film. Consequently, a great deal of the initial reviews from the Capitol were very negative. One of their chief objections was that the film made them all out to be drinking too much.
Yeah, sure.
Did you know? To make his voice hoarse for the filibuster scene, James Stewart dried out his throat with bicarbonate of soda. However, both Frank Capra and Stewart revealed in interviews that his throat was periodically swabbed with mercuric chloride. That sounds healthy. Did you know? The first film to earn 2 Best Supporting Actor Oscar nominations. Claude Rains and Harry Carey were both nominated. Both of them, however, lost to... Anybody know? Another person in this film.
Claude Rains for Casablanca, wasn't it? Or no.
1939.
Yeah.
It's Thomas Mitchell.
Yes, for Stagecoach.
There you go. All right, with that, we will take our first break, and we will be right back. Before we jump back into the episode, next week for our 236th episode, we welcome back Andrew Corns of the Revisionist Almanac and Peterson W. Hill of the War Starts at Midnight podcast for a film we definitely can't talk about, Fight Club from 1999 for its 25th anniversary. Directed by David Fincher, written by Jim Yules, music by the Dust Brothers, starring Brad Pitt, Edward Norton, Helena Bonham Carter, and Jared Leto. You won't want to miss that one, so watch ahead of the show by searching the Real Good app to find where it's streaming for you. That's REELGOOD.
Yeah, I won't be able to talk about it until next week because I've never seen it.
Oh, I haven't either.
That's okay. It's a very bleak film, Sarah. You would hate it. With a very ambiguous ending, which you also hate.
Yeah.
Yes, I do. Fucking Mark Wahlberg.
If you thought The Departed was an ambiguous ending, watch Fight Club.
I can't stand that movie. The ending.
Worse than the ending of The Sopranos?
Sarah's never seen The Sopranos, so it doesn't matter.
I haven't.
And basically, David Chase has already confirmed what happens, so it's fine.
Yeah, okay.
So, anyway, moving on. So, Sarah is a 5-time club member. Where can people find you, and what are you working on?
I am currently working on a paper, a history paper for anybody out there who reads the American Historical Association. I am looking to finally publish my first book review.
Catcher in the Rye has been done before.
No, this one is on a book review on a detailed analysis of the genocide in Bosnia.
Sounds like an entertaining romp.
Yeah, so it's a late afternoon.
Yes.
Read.
Very much so. It's why it's taken me a year to actually make it through that book, because as somebody who previously has studied genocide extensively, it can get to your mental health.
Another reason Sarah should watch Fight Club. Anyway. Brian, what are you working on, and where can people find you?
I'm on basically all of the socials at this point. If you want to find me on Blue Sky, I'm there. If you want to find me on Threads, I'm there. Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. Sonic Cinema always has reviews coming out. I just published my review on Sean Baker's Anora, and the Song Cinema podcast. We are talking about the most recent episode. We're going to be talking about the horror for the year 1974. So we're going to be talking about a few movies from that year. And also, if you'd like to hear more of me from talking about classic Hollywood, an actor friend of mine, Timothy J. Cox, and I have done a few episodes on what I call established classics, where films that are well established in the canon of Hollywood history from Hollywood's golden age. We look back on them and see if they really do hold up and why they hold up. And funnily enough, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington is one of those films that we talk about. So you can check that out on the Song Cinema podcast, wherever you listen to podcasts.
Excellent. And all of the links for our guests, as always, will be both in the show notes and on the website. So let's move to everybody's favorite segment. It's time for Ask Dana Anything. We have no audience submissions.
I did want to ask one question of you. We're talking about a political movie today, and I'm kind of curious. What are some of your favorite movies about politics?
Oh, I absolutely adore All the President's Men.
Mm-hmm.
It's not about politics, but it's about the unraveling of power politics. As far as politics itself goes, it's going to seem kind of funny, but there was a goofy film with Kevin Kline and why am I drawing a blank as to his name, called Dave. If you remember it, it's stupid, it's goofy, but there's a certain aspect of it that I really enjoyed and thought it was cute. But so those are a couple of them. The Manchurian Candidate is bleak.
Which one?
The original.
Okay, the 62 with Sinatra. Okay.
Yes. If anything else, just thank God you didn't have Angela Lansbury as a mother.
She is extraordinary in that role, but possibly the worst mother in cinema history.
Yeah. But
and that includes any of the Disney like stepmothers.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I find that, when I was growing up, if you talk to police officers, policemen would always say, if you ask them what they thought was the most realistic show on television about police, they'd always say Barney Miller. Because Barney Miller would always they'd find humor in everything. So they would find this humorous about the strange goings on in the police station. So how about, what was Gene Hackman's last film?
Welcome to Mooseport.
Mooseport.
What a name drop right here.
It's a stupid film. But again, it's the politics. I'm realizing that so much of politics is humor. Because if it's either, there's so little difference between humor and tragedy. And so much of politics is humor or tragedy.
Everybody that gets into politics these days gets in partially on the backing of the West Wing because of their idealism. But once they get there, then they say the most realistic show is Veep.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I actually have one for Dad. I have two, in fact. One I came up with to see how much I could embarrass our host. What is your favorite memory with Tom as a child?
We've kind of already gone through that one. That happened a few months back. I'll just refresh the audience's memory. It's me sitting down in the Mississippi River and my diaper ballooning.
That's one of them. I had another one I was talking about the other day. You were about 3 or 4 years old, and I bought a squirt gun to have a squirt gun fight at the house in Boston. I knew you would do this because I knew you well enough. So I filled up one gun and I handed it to you. And I started filling up mine. And you thought this is the great opportunity to really mess with my dad. And so you started squirting me. And so I dropped the gun and I ran around the side of the house. And you came charging after. Well, because I knew you were going to do that, I bought a huge squirt gun with a backpack. And I put it on, and I just, when you came around the corner of the house, just went, it just soaked you. And you came around the corner and went, Mom, it's no fair. Dad's got a bigger water gun.
I mean, that would be cheap and trollish like you, much like the time where I was sick and you said, here, I've brought you this new toy that'll help you compete so that you can win Fisher-Price Castle against me. Except you didn't realize or reveal that you also had a different one that would help you up the ante on your side behind your back the entire time. Or
I gave you a Cyclops. I can't help
you
but the
gave
fire
me the
breathing.
sea serpent thing that was almost useless because there was no sea anywhere close to anything.
It was a fire-breathing dragon.
It wasn't.
Yeah, it was.
No, it wasn't. Anyway.
Pretty sure it was.
And, or the time, I know exactly what it is, and I know where I can find it. I can even prove this. So anyway, the point also being that, like the time that we first signed up for NBA fantasy basketball, and during Shaq's 2000 MVP season, you had me trade you Shaq and Vince Carter during his heyday as well for Kevin Garnett, one of my favorite players of the time, and Vlade Divac. And I, being a naive 10-year-old, assumed my dad wouldn't screw me over.
I could have done better and named you Sue.
All right, so what's your second question?
What has your favorite family vacation been, and why?
Well, I don't know. I guess when we did the world tour, visiting the kids in 2005, was it?
I was 10.
That sounds...
It was the summer I turned 10.
2006?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because I became 16 while I was there, so they took me out drinking.
Okay. So, and, because we were in Germany, we were in Denmark, Sweden, Hungary, and, because we had all, for the audience who does not know, we've hosted 18 exchange students from around the world. And so we had an opportunity to go and
16 of which we still recognize.
Yes. We have...
You know who you are.
We had an opportunity to go visit several of them, not to mention your mother's host family, because she had been an exchange student in Germany as well. And so even though there aren't a lot of great stories, although we will not discuss Tom and his vodka consumption, although that wasn't then, was
that
it?
was the Christmas in Germany
Christmas
in
a few
2010.
years later, yeah.
His trip down the Reeperbahn was when we were there when he was 16, though.
Yeah, if anybody in the audience really wants to have a great stories, just send Tom vodka, because whenever Tom consumes vodka, it always ends up in some sort of story that is quite hilarious.
But for whatever reason, despite my heritage, vodka does not agree with my system, and it usually ends in pretty much one way. It's coming back up.
All right. So.
All right. Yep. So we can move on now.
Let's get back to the heart of the story.
So we left off at best performance. Dad, who did you have down?
I have Frank Capra. This is such the quintessential Frank Capra film. You have no choice. Even though you may like Jimmy Stewart as my secondary performance, it's still Capra. I mean, you could put anybody into that role and it would still come out the same, and it would be Capra.
I don't agree. I mean, I can completely understand where you're coming from as far as the tone and the sentimentality, and we've discussed it on other Capra films. Namely, we did It Happened One Night earlier this year. But I still think that James Stewart is the best performance for me because he's got a doughy-eyed naivete about him that I don't think you would have gotten from like a Gary Cooper or something else. To me, he kind of makes the story, and there's almost nobody better in the annals of Hollywood who can play disheveled better than James Stewart.
I don't know. Have you ever seen Meet John Doe? It's another Capra film. That's with Gary Cooper.
You mean Mr. Deeds, don't you?
No, I mean Meet John Doe. It was from
Okay.
1940 with Gary Cooper.
No, so but frankly,
he did the doughy-eyed, Mr. Nobody who gets in and gets caught up in things that he can't control or understand.
I'm sorry, I still don't buy Gary Cooper doing that, though. I've seen him in Sergeant York, and I've seen him in The Pride of the Yankees, where he's supposed to be that guy, and he's not particularly believable, in my opinion. Other best performances.
I'm going to go with Jean Arthur as Saunders. I think she's absolutely terrific as this cynical, hardened person who's familiar with Washington, with the way Washington works, but who gradually comes to respect and appreciate what Jefferson Smith is trying to do. And that evolution in her, it comes in fits and spurts, admittedly, but by the end of the movie, you understand completely why she's doing what she's doing, and he's clearly inspired something into her that she wants to see him triumphant against the Washington machine.
I think there are three really good answers to this question. Jean Arthur is one of them. I think the other one being Claude Rains. I think the three central acting performances are extraordinary in this one. But if you're going to go with probably an audience avatar, it's most likely going to be Jean Arthur. That you going into the movie, you probably have a very cynical view of politics, and coming out of it, you're kind of inspired a little bit by Jeff Smith, or at least that's the hope. I apparently stole Sarah's answer.
Yeah, you actually did. And for the part of the reason that I was going to say him is because you can't have a charismatic character or even just so much of a charismatic actor as Jimmy Stewart play this kind of role without someone to hate.
I don't know if I hate Claude Rains in this film, though.
He's good at need a good villain, somebody that you're up against as an oppositionary force, and I think he plays this guy who got swept up into everything and ended up becoming slowly over his time there this cynical man who got his head stuck in the sand. And it's someone that you have to feel for, but also at the same time you disdain for what he's doing. And I think he does a good job of that.
I think I disdain Claude Rains. I think if you're going to go with an antagonist, it's Edward Arnold.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Taylor's the overarching villain in this movie. I mean, really, it's the system, but he represents the system. I do agree with what you're saying as far as Claude Rains, but I think he is, I would say he's an antagonist, but more now villain. He is somebody who I think might have gotten into politics for a lot of the same reasons that Jefferson Smith did at one point, but has been taken over by it, to your point. And Rains is just one of the best actors of this era of Hollywood. Actually, just probably in general. Like, you watch The Invisible Man, you watch Casablanca, you watch basically anything he's in. He's just absolutely amazing.
One of his performances that no one remembers, it's a very underrated film, Hitchcock's Notorious.
Yeah.
I love him in Notorious.
Mm-hmm. I have yet to see a Rains performance that I disliked, but he has a very specific quality to him where he feels like a snake oil salesman at all times that could stick you with the knife if you're not careful.
He has a knack for being suave, but seedy. The only other actor that I've seen that has that same quality is James Mason.
If you want a funny thing, and I'm sorry about this, but on Colbert, Bill Hader's impression of James Mason is glorious. So go look that up. All right, moving on though. Best secondary performances, I had Claude Rains. We won't belabor the point. Other best secondary performances.
I gave mine.
I love Harry Carey as the as the president of the Senate. I just absolutely love him whenever he's interacting with Jefferson Smith. You see that he's supportive of Jefferson Smith in a lot of ways, and I just love any moment we see him on screen. He's just absolutely wonderful.
Every time that he's stifling a smile or a laugh at Jeff's expense, more or less, and you're like, oh, he gets it. He wishes things were like this. It's a wholesome thing. It's not like cheapened in any way. And so I get that rewarding sense from him every time.
I had Clarissa Saunders.
So Jean Arthur.
Yep. Well, I just think she's a wonderful character, and she's one of those people that the whole progression of the film, and you see this too with Claude Rains' character, Joseph Payne, of they hit this breaking point, and then they start to just change their minds about what's going on, and she just does this so well, and being swayed over by him, and it just helps to build the story along.
I had her as my most charismatic. I think that she and Stewart have a very good chemistry together, and I think even for a movie that for the most part, is dismissed, a Best Picture winner in You Can't Take It With You, that they're together in, or that they're a more romantic couple, or at least more emphasized than they were in this movie. There's kind of a connection, but she's a very endearing female lead. And again, for somebody that we've mentioned on a couple of occasions is cynical, but has kind of her heart melt for Jefferson Smith, she does a good job of relaying to the audience that your heart can melt too, that his naivete can be romanticized, and so you fall in love with him. So as an audience avatar, I think she's incredibly important to the movie, and kind of the way she looks at him throughout the film just changes how you see him throughout the film as well.
Most charismatic, I have Harry Carey. When you think about silent film era, they had to do most of their acting with facial expressions and such, because the lines meant nothing. You couldn't hear them unless you had the type card in between scenes. So you can tell that Harry Carey got his start as a silent film star, doing westerns and such, but he can, more with a facial expression, a smirk, a kind of hidden chuckle, say more than any line. You know where he's coming from, what's going on. And for what really was a part that had, I don't know how many minutes, I'll bet it was less if you totaled it up, less than 10 minutes in the film, and he gets a Best Actor nomination. I don't think I'm alone in that. Or a Best Supporting Actor. Yeah. Nomination. I don't think I'm alone in seeing his brilliance in that role. And so I think he stole most of the filibuster scenes at times.
I would agree with that. I for my most charismatic award, I have to go with Stewart as Jefferson Smith. I love this character, and whether it's the first time that when he and Payne are on the train going to Washington, and they're talking about Jefferson's father and his relationship with Payne, and setting up the lost causes idea that's going to culminate in the filibuster scene. His his wide-eyed excitement of being in the nation's capital and the pigeons to take messages home to Ma and all of that. Like, as corny as it is, he's just absolutely, he's magnetic in this film, and I absolutely love his performance. It's probably my favorite performance of his.
He really makes you believe he's genuine, which is the trick to the performance. Because as you mentioned, all those little characteristics, if you add them up, and they could be very easily dismissed as corny or whatever else. But because he feels genuine, you buy in on his character. If there was any hint of cynicism towards that, or it was not played with the sincerity, I don't think that you get this movie.
And also, I mean, he doesn't come off as a movie star in this movie. He doesn't come off as a movie star who, oh, I'm the lead of the movie, so I project this certain feeling onto the screen. It's, to your point, it's a very genuine performance. You feel like he is an everyman. He is a regular guy getting this extraordinary opportunity.
I had him as my most charismatic too, because Jimmy Stewart in almost any character, let alone this character, has this innate ability to just pull you along. And you can't help but get swept up in whatever he's doing. He's so brilliant to watch as an actor that you can get lost in almost any movie you see him in, and that's always been the case for me. And especially in this character, that final filibuster scene, the comedy of it, the delivery of it, the drama of it, all at once is a very hard thing to pull off and do so with the kind of power that he does, but also while being, not only as you put it, sincere, but with this kind of awe that he has of this place that he gets to stand in. And, he brings this up at multiple times throughout the thing, is liberty is not something that ought to be buried in like history books. It's something that you need to show off and be proud of. And so you get to see this throughout that entire scene of him just being in awe of what the idealists of democracy believe in and how it's become warped. And so he's in awe of both the political system and how it's been corrupted, and you get to just drag along with him, and it's this very powerful experience. At least I saw it that way when I was first watching this movie.
Let's move to best scene then. I have 5 nominees here. I have nominating Jeff, so the opening sequence where the governor is trying to decide who he's going to nominate to the Senate. Then I have arriving in Washington with the pigeons and all, and then him kind of going on this whirlwind tour, which apparently the National Park Service didn't let them film there, so I don't know how they got the footage. But drafting a bill, which is his night with Saunders.
I looked into it. He did something, it's called guerrilla filming, and it's one of the only times that it has ever been actually put into a major motion picture.
No, Sarah.
That's
There's been tons of guerrilla filming.
But, like,
at
on
the time,
scale,
maybe.
Yes, at the time.
North by Northwest guerrilla filming. He told them,
but they had permission to be in the park in Service. General.
Okay,
the
they
French
weren't allowed
Connection,
to be on top of the
Rocky.
monument.
The 70s was filled with guerrilla filmmaking.
Yeah.
Anyway. And North by Northwest is not guerrilla filmmaking.
Okay.
It's not. Anyway. Then I have drafting a bill, so it's Stewart and Saunders together trying to work on the bill, and their kind of conversations at night where he breaks down her barriers. Then I have starting the filibuster, and I have finally the ending sequence where Payne takes the rap. Out of these, what did I leave out? Or what do you think should have been included?
The fix is in, which is the whole sequence of the disclosure of how they're framing him.
So does that include the committee meetings?
Yes.
Okay.
Personally, I also want to throw in that scene where everybody else leaves and Jimmy Stewart turns to
President of the Senate.
President of the Senate and just makes a joke about how they don't have a quorum, and I think it's so light and kind of goofy.
I want to go to the sort of not quite the scene where they're drafting the bill, but the scene where Saunders is telling Jefferson Smith the process of how a bill works in Washington, and then of course the punchline of and then it's the end of term. So basically, you've done all that work and it's not going anywhere. I think that's an absolutely fantastic scene.
All right, so I have nominating Jeff, arriving in Washington, drafting a bill, the fix is in, Senate walkout, starting the filibuster, and Payne takes the rap. Out of these, what is the best scene?
Starting the filibuster to me is, because it's really the quintessential point of the film where it turns, where up until then you think Jeff is just way over his head. This is the opportunity where he has to turn the tables and defend himself and to turn the direction of everything going on.
I'm going to go with Payne takes the rap. I think everything in the movie is leading to that moment, and if that doesn't work, the movie doesn't work. And you have such an interesting connection of different characters. You have Harry Carey doing his thing up at the front of the Senate. You have Stewart with his hoarse voice. You have Claude Rains coming in with the baskets of letters that are probably just fixed. But then at the end, him coming back in and, I'm not fit to live. Expel me. So I do think that for me, and it will also be my most indelible because it's the number one thing I think about when I think of this movie is the ending. But I'll go with that.
It's so Perry Mason. You know, like all of a sudden he's just going to suddenly.
Capra.
It was just.
You love It's a Wonderful Life, and It's a Wonderful Life ends in the exact same fashion. Oh, everybody brought money and we're pitching in to help him. Oh, goody.
You can see that, but there's nothing until that last few moments that says that Claude Rains is going to change and suddenly shift on a dime.
I completely disagree. He said at every turn, I don't want to do this to him. I have a connection to him. You feel the pressure building within him. You can see him sitting and squirming in his seat.
Okay.
I'm sorry. I watched a different movie.
I do love the scene where Payne takes the rap, but I don't know. I'm kind of with Dana on this, where I don't know that turn happens until Jefferson Smith calls him out and says, I guess this is another one of those lost causes. But I also think at a certain point, Payne makes a conscious decision to go all in with Taylor on what he's doing with Jefferson Smith. And I think that's kind of where, I mean, I agree with you to the sense that we have to get to that moment where Payne gets his conscience back. I just don't know if it's as pronounced, as obvious that he's going to get to that point throughout. I do think the start of the filibuster is absolutely wonderful. And because of the fact that it really does kind of take Jefferson from being a passive hero in this movie to an active one, and basically taking his fate into his own hands. That's the first time in this movie he's really doing that. Even while he's drafting the bill, he's still doing what he's trying to think he's supposed to do in Washington. The filibuster is the first time he's really taking action for himself. And that's why I think in the end I lean towards the start of the filibuster.
I've got to say the filibuster as well. As much as that kind of just wraps up everything, I think without that, I think that's the climax point. Like, that, honestly, it's the build that gives us the delivery towards the end.
Favorite scene, I'll go with nominating Jeff. I like the opening of this movie because it's kind of French farce style. It's got a lot of ins and outs and weaves here and there. He's got one side opposing the other, and he can't really make up his mind. He flips a coin and all of a sudden finds Jefferson Smith. So there's kind of a wackiness to the opening of this that I enjoy, and it gets you entered into the film without feeling like you've been shotgunned into it. Other favorite scenes?
I do genuinely enjoy the scene where Jefferson Smith is with the press for the first time, and he's being very sincere in the way that they turn that on him. I think that is one of those moments where it's one of the few moments in this film that feels like it's kind of timeless. Like you could do that type of scene now and you would believe it just as much as you did then.
For me, the favorite scene is the fixes in, because it just showed to me how utterly easy, whenever you want it to be, if you have the right connections and the enough money, you can create a false narrative and make it stick.
Mine was drafting the bill. It just shows this kind of, you get to learn something about Jefferson's character in this. You get to see like this really wonderful moment between his character and Jean Arthur. In that too, it provides some of his depth of and his resolve of, this is why I think in the way that I do about democracy. It provides some context for the lead up of this. And then also, it's just kind of a fun scene to watch the two of them interact and show some of that chemistry that we see in other scenes. But it's one of the few times where they're like completely just alone, the two of them delivering some what could be construed as humorous lines if not delivered correctly, and I don't know, it provides a little bit of light.
As far as most indelible, I will repeat that the ending to me with Senator Payne coming back in after the gunshot is the number one thing I think about in this movie.
I think for me, it's the moment when Jefferson collapses after all of the letters and all of the telegrams and stuff like that have been brought in. And the thing that I think is fascinating about the filibuster scene is that ultimately it's not the filibuster that saves the day for him. It's the fact that Payne confesses to everything. And so the filibuster certainly helps him get to that point, but at the same time, it's we think of it as a heroic moment, but really it's it truly is a lost cause moment because it's basically a Hail Mary that he's throwing up. And I always find myself kind of surprised by the way it ends because of the fact that it feels like a very un-Capra-esque way of ending that movie. I mean, especially if you compare it to It's a Wonderful Life, where, I mean, obviously the ending is George realizes how important he is to the fabric of his town, and then his town comes to his rescue. That's a quintessential happy ending, but really, the happy ending is Capra works around to getting to the happy ending as opposed to going straight through it like he did with It's a Wonderful Life later.
I'm going to agree with Thomas and say that scene at the end where Payne comes out, you can see it from the moment Stewart collapses. You can see everything written across his face of, this is what my impropriety has come to. I am watching this man that I have respect for give everything to a cause. I used to do the same, and then you watch him leave and have this inner war with himself before finally rushing back in after the gun goes off, surrounded by all these men, having this moment where he just snaps because he can't deal with it. And I think it's a powerful moment.
For me, it's starting the filibuster, and for the same reasons I indicated that I thought it was the best scene. So I don't have much more to add to that.
All right, that looks like a good spot for our second break. We will be right back. Before we jump back into the episode, and before we get to the Stanley Rubric in a minute, if you're ever curious about our Master Greatest Movies of All Time list that has every graded movie we've ever discussed on the show, there's a link in the episode description of every episode of this show, or you can go to RonnieDuncanStudios.com/GMode podcast and find it as the top entry on the Greatest Movie of All Time podcast show page. That is the grades we've done so far for all 211 movies we've graded, and we continue to add more each week. Make sure to check that out as we go and follow along. All right, Dad, do we have anyone to remember this week?
Yes, unfortunately, we have a long list. Tom Jarrell, 89, American journalist, was on 2020 and was a frequent host on ABC World News Tonight. David Harris, 75, American actor, The Warriors, Brubaker, Quicksilver, and A Soldier's Story. Michael Newman, 68, American actor and lifeguard, was in Baywatch. Jerry Taylor, 86, American television writer and producer, Star Trek The Next Generation and Star Trek Voyager, also Quincy, M.E. Phil Lesh, 84, American Hall of Fame musician with the Grateful Dead and songwriter of Box of Rain and Truckin'. Myra McFadden, 68, English actress, Maid of Honor, Mamma Mia, and Emma. Alan Sachs, 81, American television writer and producer, did Chico and the Man and Welcome Back, Kotter. And finally, Jack Jones, 86, American singer, did Wives and Lovers and the theme song Love Boat, and an actor over the garden wall. I would comment about Phil Lesh. The Grateful Dead is supposed to receive Lincoln Center honors in December. Unfortunately, he passed before that. The one thing I remember about Phil Lesh is he was a classically trained violinist, and he was recruited to be a guitarist for the Grateful Dead by Jerry Garcia. And he says, I don't know how to play the guitar. And Jerry Garcia said, play it like you would play a violin. And so he's considered one of the classic guitarists of all time. And Jack Jones, I mean, if you grew up in the 80s, him singing The Love Boat, yeah, well, okay.
And so we remember these here fondly with a moment of silence in their honor. Thank you. Let's move to best funniest lines. I'll start with Jefferson Smith. I guess this is just another lost cause, Mr. Payne. All you people don't know about lost causes. Mr. Payne does. He said once they were the only causes worth fighting for, and he fought for them once. For the only reason any man ever fights for them, because of just one plain simple rule. Love thy neighbor.
Jefferson Smith. Oh, I'm just going to sit around and listen. Page boy Richard Jones. That's the way to get reelected.
Jefferson Smith. I wouldn't give you 2 cents for all your fancy rules if behind them they didn't have a little bit of plain, ordinary, everyday kindness and a little looking out for the other fella, too.
Mine is, I'm sorry, gentlemen. I know I'm being disrespectful to this honorable body. I know that. A guy like me should never be allowed to get in here in the first place, and I know that. And I hate to stand here and try your patience like this, but either I'm dead right or I'm crazy. You wouldn't care to put that to a vote, would you, Senator?
Clarissa. Your friend Mr. Lincoln had his tailors and pains. So did every other man who tried to lift his thought up off of the ground. Odds against them didn't stop those men. They were fools that way. All the good that ever came into this world came from fools with faith like that. You know that, Jeff? You can't quit now. Not you. They aren't all Taylors and Paynes in Washington. That kind just throw big shadows, that's all. You didn't just have faith in Payne or any other living man. You had faith in something bigger than that. You had plain, decent, everyday common rightness, and this country could use some of that. Yeah, so could the whole cockeyed world. A lot of it.
James Taylor, your political future? Why, I bought it for you. I gave it to you as a present. I can grab it back so fast it'll make your head swim. You've got nerve to sit there and worry about your political future when we're in a spot like this?
Jefferson Smith, pointing to his new desk in the Senate with great enthusiasm. This is Daniel Webster's desk. Did you know that? Senator Payne. He won't mind.
Welcome, Senator. The wildlife around here is a little different from what you're used to. They wear high heels.
Well, sir, just took my last one. So, Brian, you have any left?
No.
Dad?
No, I'm out. So go ahead.
Sarah?
I have one in Liberty's Too Precious a Thing to be Buried in Books, Miss Saunders.
All right, let's move to the Stanley rubric then. The first thing up is legacy. This is a measurement of the legacy of the film after the initial 5 years in which it was released. So roughly 1944 to today, the last 80 years. How is this film perceived both in the industry and the general public or audience at large? Now, the audience at large can be, as we've titled them, the normies, the casual film fans, people who maybe see like 5 a year, and the more, let's say, cinema inclined of us. Not quite us podcasters, who I would consider more of the industry, but those that are heavy cinephiles. So we divide this category 5 and 5 between those two groups for a total of 10. Dad, would you like to go first or second?
I'll go first. I think this film, by classic insiders, the people who rank films as the best films of all times, the ones who follow and figure out which films are the best done by the best directors, hold this in high regard. So I'm going to give it, for a legacy for that group, a 4. I think it's considered one of Capra's best for the industry, and I think it's on many of the primary lists. For the public, though, I was actually a little bit surprised because originally I had this pegged as being somewhat, because it's an 85-year-old film, something that was going to probably be for the public down around a 1. But when we did our informal poll among our very average non-cinemaphile people in the office, there was a surprising number of who had heard of it. And about not quite, maybe a quarter of them had actually seen it.
3 out of like 20 hands is not a quarter.
Okay, well, I didn't give it that big of a bump up. So for the public, I'm at a 2. So I'm at a 6.5 overall.
So I have many of the same arguments that you do, but I come at it apparently at a very different level. I think that this is well judged by the industry. I don't know if it's in quite that like upper echelon, the Casablancas, the Raging Bulls, the like those films, The Godfather, Citizen Kane. And I think there's a cleave between the like really artsy international cinema crowd that really loves like audacious movies and stuff that's maybe a little off the beaten path. Those would be the ones that have John Dielman as the number 1 film on the Sight and Sound poll. Whereas the AFI, to me, is a much better representation of a mixture of popular and critically acclaimed film. And so I would tend to go more in that route. But I don't think that this is going to make like the Sight and Sound poll, but it definitely made it high on the AFI list. So I kind of split the difference a little bit, and I went with a 4.5 because this is a top-ranked film for certain film critics. It's not quite on the same level as a few of the other early favorites that they like to like highlight constantly, such as certain Chaplin films get a lot of play from this era. It's not quite on the same level as a Gone with the Wind as far as notoriety and accomplishment and etc. I don't even think it's quite on the same level of The Wizard of Oz. So that's why I go with a 4.5 there. As far as the general audience and public, I think they're familiar with several of the people that are in these movies, partially because it's familiarity with It's a Wonderful Life, who shares a lot of the same actors and its director and its sentimentality. But there's a kind of West Wing style quality to the naivete and the idealism and the romanticism of politics that I think feels very familiar and lived in for a lot of people. So this is also a film that I would venture to say is likely to have been seen in a lot of civics classes at some era of time. So your casual relationship with it might be tangential, but I'll come down at a 4 there. I have an 8.5.
So I came in at a 4 for critically acclaimed because, again, this film is like one of those that's on every list. And while I hadn't actually seen it, I'd heard of it for so long prior to us actually sitting down and watching it. But one of those things that I will say moved my needle the other way as far as like pop culture and so goes. I've seen pictures of this movie long before I knew what this movie was. Long before I knew what the name of this film was, I'd seen pictures of Jimmy Stewart in this in the Senate building there, in this filibuster scene. And it's still, to an extent, like when you look up this film, it makes an impact on politics even. People, by and large, still think that the filibuster still functions in the way that it does in this film, and it's not exactly the same. I think it still exists in the zeitgeist for the common man to an extent, so I gave it a 4 for that as well. So I'm at an 8.
So, within the industry, you can look at the Oscar nominations, you can look at the AFI, you can look at just how much this. I do think that this movie has endured quite a bit. I featured it as one of my established classics. I do think it gains that reputation for a reason because of the fact that I think Capra is well beloved. I think Jimmy Stewart is well beloved. All of the supporting characters actors are well beloved. So yeah, I would put this probably about 4 as far as audience, common audience. As Sarah mentioned, I was aware of this film before I even saw this film. Like she said, you see images of Jimmy Stewart during the filibuster scene. The Simpsons did an episode parodying this movie with Lisa, and it makes a lot of sense. That said, I do think modern audiences, they don't have quite the appreciation for classic cinema or quite the awareness to search out classic cinema despite all of the various streaming services. So I don't know that it holds quite the same allure to the general public as more recent movies do. Thinking about All the President's Men, thinking about Dave, thinking about movies like that. So I would probably put that at a 3. So I would probably say a 7 would be my total.
So that's a 7.5 average between the 4 of us. Impact and significance. I think this is something that obviously did well at the box office at the time. I think it had cultural impact, both foreign and domestic at the time. It's hard to argue that based on the Did You Know section that I had from before. It held 11 Oscars. It's the first one to have 2 supporting actors nominated for the same award in the same year. It's a fairly monumental film by probably the largest living director at the time and the president of the Academy when this film was made, a 2-time Oscar winner. I think I go with a 9.5, 4.5 for the industry and a 5 for the audience at the time. I only give the half point off just because there was a little bit of critical and political backlash that I'll bake in a little bit.
I'm Not going to add a whole lot more than you, Tom. I'm at the same numbers exactly. I'm not going to add a whole lot more. I went slightly down simply because it only won one of the 11 Oscars it was nominated for.
I'd also accept an argument where, like, comparatively to Gone with the Wind, which kind of blotted out the sun that year, you can't put it at a 5 at the same time that Gone with the Wind was there. So there is that.
As far as impact at the time, this was, as I said before, there were protests that were lodged against it because it was seen as un-American. It was banned in several communist and fascist regimes at the time. So this had a lot of people talking about it and was wildly popular at the time despite all of those things. So it did definitely, I think, have an impact, which is why I'm setting this at like a 4.5. Now, as far as significance, I think the fact that there is actually a quote from the Senate Majority Leader in 1987, Robert Byrd. He actually mentioned, has there ever been a better movie about the Senate than Frank Capra's 1939 classic, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, on the floor? Now, the fact that that's still being brought up in politics at that point, 50 years later, I think it says something about the fact that it has had a lasting impact, and by the fact that it's still being shown in politics classes and taught about, I think it does have more of a significance than the average person is necessarily going to always think about. So I sat this at a 3.5.
So you have an 8.
Yep. Or no, I had a 7.5 total.
And I should add here, because I forgot to explain what the category is. This is also a division between the industry and the audience, much like the last category, except this is a category that is focused on the 5 years after it was released, so roughly 1939 to 1944. So Sarah's comments on Robert Byrd should have been reserved for legacy, not impact and significance. But regardless, this is still a 5 and 5 category of how the film made an impact in its initial moment of release and subsequently thereafter. And there are several things that can be associated with that. Box office is one. Comments and critical acclaim at the time, Oscar nominations, those would all be worthy of criteria for this category.
So I'm going to go with I think I'm going to go with a 4.25 as far as immediate impact. Yes, as far as the box office was huge, the Academy Award nominations, but as has been said, it only won one. You understand that when in the context of Gone with the Wind being nominated, but at the same time, it's still one of those things that we even look at now where a movie that gets 10 or more nominations and either wins one or doesn't win at all, it's seen as, well, how much of an impact did that movie have? As far as significance, I mean, yeah, I think when what's been said as far as the significance in the immediate moment in terms of how it was received, how it was controversial, I think all of that, and how it set a tone for how we look at the Senate is definitely part of it. So I'm going to go with a 4 for that, so an 8.25.
Not helping me with the decimals there, Brian.
That's why you have a calculator, Tom.
Well, do you want to do the math on this one for me, Dad?
It's okay. I'll let you do it.
It's an 8.81 average between the four of us.
Okay.
Novelty. For this category, we have started to divide the category much in the same way we did the last two categories between a 5 and 5. 1 5 set being for the originality of the idea, so maybe that's the story, or maybe it's certain breaking like technology, other things that could be a part of that. And then a 5 is reserved for the quality of the execution on what they capitalized on that idea. So for this one, I will say, and I guess I'll start, But I feel that this was somewhat of a novel idea, and that's why it was so out of place, and there was certain levels of backlash both in Congress as well as several other institutional organizations of the time. We mentioned the Boy Scouts. The Senate has been there, the Senate Press Corps, and their reservations against the film. So from that standpoint, I do think it's novel. Is it the most novel thing of the time? Probably not. So I'm going to go with a 4.5. I also think, though, that this is a very well executed film. I think that its lead performances, for the most part, are very well done. There are a few things that I think are a little touch and go as far as filmmaking. Part of it maybe the guerrilla film style of walking around and getting the monuments and that sort of thing, since they didn't have the appeal of doing it quite in the way they would have wanted to at the time. But I have a 4 on that side. I have an 8.5. So whomever would like to go.
I think as far as novelty, I think everything you said, Thomas, makes a lot of sense as far as the novelty. Is it one of those truly original ideas? No, I don't think it is. I think the setting, I think the type of story at the time was certainly unique. And so, I mean, I think a 4.5 makes a lot of sense. As far as the execution, I think this movie is extremely well executed. I think it is one of my personal choices for one of the best films ever made, or I should say one of the best films I've ever seen. I'm going to go ahead and give this a 5, so I'm going to say 9.5.
I am going to give the first half of this a 4, and that's by and large. This did start a conversation. It did start a debate, which I've talked about before, but I don't really think as far as an art form, it may have pushed the boundaries as much as it could have. I think it was very well executed and a very original idea. And for that, in total, I will be giving this a 8.
Originality, it is almost completely original. It's not perfect. So I can't go with a full 5. I went with a 4.5. I mean, there have been other stories with Congress and whatever, okay? Now, originally, when I started thinking about this, I was thinking the execution was really well done, but it's not, okay. It's not great. And I originally had a 4. And then I thought back, and the scene where Jean Arthur convinces Jimmy Stewart to come back to the Senate and do the filibuster, filmed at the Lincoln Memorial, and it's all in shadows with light behind them. And it's good versus evil through the entire scene. And I, more than any other scene, I look at that and go, wow, that is one of the most memorable scenes with light and shadow I have ever seen. And so I'm going to go up to a full 5 on execution for that scene alone, because I think that should be in every film class's portfolio for how you set image and how you do camera and cinematography. So I'm going with a 9.5 overall.
All right, so that is an 8.88 average between the 4 of us. Classicness. Now, we did have a question about this last week as to why our baseline is a 7. Again, for a reminder to the audience, if you didn't listen to the Saw episode, as I'm sure that's kind of a niche group of people, but we started a baseline of 7 on this category because there's a lot more room to move down on how well something has aged than there is to move up on something, at least in our opinion. Now, I usually give points for timelessness as a way of going up. This film would fall into that potential category given its relative age. But you could factor in a multitude of different things as far as the graphics, how it's changed, the sentiments of the movie has changed, the technology or other things have gone into this category before. If it's humorous, does it still make you laugh? Does it still make you feel? All of those can be attributed here. So, with that, Dad, we usually let you lead this category. Please take it away.
I always start at 7, as we've indicated. And The only reason I can't go all the way up is, again, and it's a microcosm of the times. I mean, it was a male-dominated, lily white film, and so I can't give it a perfect, but not trying to weight it down too much because it was a film from 1939, and it is a reflection of what society was at that time. I'm going with a 9.5. I don't find anything about this. Maybe I should have went to a 9 because there's a certain naivete about it, but it's the time of at that time there was a naivete, so I didn't score it down because of that.
I'm going to go with a 9.5 just because of the fact that I do think the execution is completely there. Yes, it is dated because it's a product of its time. It's all male, all white Senate, which certainly would not be the case now. What's something Sarah mentioned earlier as far as the filibuster, a lot of people still feel like this is what the filibuster is when it's very much metastasized into something very different. And it's not often that we see the talking filibuster the way we used to, and the way we see it in this film. That being said, I think this is I think the thing that really this still encapsulates a sense of hope coming out of the Great Depression. The common man pulling themselves back out of the Great Depression. And I think that is a context that is very important to why this film works as well as it did, and why it worked with audiences as well as it did. So yeah, I'm going to go with a 9.5.
I think it's a wash from the naivete to the romanticism of the politics in this film. I do think that one of the calling cards of it is its idealism and its romanticism. So I figure that's point up, point down. I'll kind of leave it as where it is. The one place where I could really find fault with this movie is its dated references in politics, and kind of the way that politics operates is very different from what we do now, especially as politics has become more nationalized, as it's become kind of a form of entertainment and to a degree sports. So I took a point off for that. But this film is really old, and for the most part, it does not have any major issues in the same way that like Gone with the Wind does. So from that standpoint, I have to look at this and say, I'll probably give it an extra 2.5 points up for the overall timelessness of it. I'm going to go with an 8.5.
So I guess I'm middle of the pack because I'm giving this a 9. As what was brought up before, not everything is the same. So there's a few parts that have aged about this. However, the humor holds up, which makes it more timeless to me. But I don't think that it was greatly ahead of its time. I think it has a message that needed to be said at that time. And I do think it started, like, to an extent, the romanticization of politics in, like, TV and television, because there are times where I looked at this movie and thought very much West Wing. But it is a classic film that still has something to say. So sticking with my 9 total.
All right, that is a 9.13 average between the four of us. Rewatchability. Sarah, let's let you go first.
So for me, this is very rewatchable. It's not something I'm going to run out and do every month or every year even. But if I see that it's on TCM or whatever, it's one of those that I'm going to turn on, especially if it's somebody that I know hasn't seen it before or loves classic films. This is a easily watchable kind of fun movie for me. And it is one of those, Jimmy Stewart is classic, so I'll rewatch almost anything he does. He just he's a fantastic everyman. I would say, as far as my own, like, rewatchability, I'll give this a 3.5. I think overall, though...
3.5 out of 10?
Oh, I'm sorry. I was splitting it into 2, because that's what I was told to do.
I mean, you can if you have 2 different
Kieran
degrees,
B.
but...
But overall, I'd say I'd give this a 7.
This is an extremely rewatchable film for me. To Sarah's point, it's not necessarily one that I'm going to watch frequently, but it's one that if I have a hard time coming up with something else to watch, or if I'm in a particular mood to watch something, I have no problem turning to it. It's one of my favorite movies from this era. I genuinely just love watching it, and I'm going to do a 9.5 here. It's just extremely rewatchable for me.
Okay. My baseline is a film that I will rewatch on a regular basis is about a 6. And I'm going to put this at that 6 mark, which is I'm going to rewatch it. It's going to be on my list. It's going to go through on a cycle and go through on a periodic basis. About every other year or so, this is a film that will come up on my list. It's not going to be in the year or the every 6 months or 8 months type of thing. So I'm just going to go with a 6.
All right. For me, I often use our Kieran B test, which splits this category between putting it on and leaving it on. You can use a whole bunch of other tests. That's why I didn't really explain this on the front end. This is our most subjective category. It's just kind of how much do you really kind of like this movie enough that you feel that you could get more out of it with repeated viewings. As far as putting it on my own personal rubric, I would probably put this somewhere between probably watching it every few years, and if I had to put it on, like I said, I think I've watched it maybe 3 or 4 times, probably every 2 years in the last few years, so to me that's about a 2.5. As far as leaving it on, though, I do think it's wholesome. I do wonder, because this film has kind of changed depending on my mood when I was watching it and how I've approached the movie and what I actually thought of it, that this comes down somewhere between I'd watch a few scenes or I'd watch a few minutes. And so for me, that's roughly about a 3.5. So I also have a 6. So that gives us a 7.13 average between the 4 of us. Now, as far as audience score on this one, Google users gave it an 89% and Rotten Tomato users gave it a 94%. That gives us a 9.25. So, to repeat the categories, we had a 7.5 for legacy, an 8.81 for impact and significance, an 8.88 for novelty, a 9.13 for classicness, a 7.13 for rewatchability, and a 9.25 for audience score, giving us a final total of 50.7, and currently placing it on our list between Citizen Kane and Wall-E for number 45. As always, if you disagree with any of our scoring, you can write us at greatestalltimemoviepodcast@gmail.com. You can find us on any of our socials at GMotePodcast on TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, as well as YouTube and Letterboxd. Or you can find us at RonnieDuncanStudios.com/GMotePodcast. Let us turn to remaining questions on this one. My first one, why the hell was the British national anthem played as the last song of the movie?
My country 'tis of thee. It was much more popular when I was a kid, and it came through that time frame. So that's what was being played, not the British national anthem.
Still weird.
Okay.
Anyway, number 2 that I have down. Could you do this movie again today? And if so, how? And would it be believable? And I'm not saying like a direct ripoff. Like, obviously there are some very dated things about the movie, but could you basically do it with the same level of sentimentality?
No.
Yes.
I don't
think you could. I think we're so aware of politics now in terms of the way politics operates that it would be very difficult to do this movie today. I mean, could you do a story similar to this? Possibly. I mean, there's some modern day equivalent, figures that you could possibly do this type of story with, but it would be very difficult just because of how familiar and how aware of the political process we are today.
Could you, would you on the National Mall? Could you, would you in an inaugural ball?
Thank you, Dr. Seuss.
Sarah said yes, so go ahead.
Yes, in that I'm just going to pull up Tom Hanks. Tom Hanks is capable of it. He is a wonderful actor with the same level of sincerity, with the same level of everyman as Jimmy Stewart. We've said it for years that he is the modern Jimmy Stewart, and I think it works. And I think it still has something to say and could be done if done right. And that would be a hard thing to do. I think it is possible if you get the right collection of people behind it. But it's still so apparent, and we still have so much of this going on behind closed doors. And if you need any more evidence of that, literally just turn on the news. We've had how many people arrested in the last few months over political corruption issues and everything else. And I think that, yeah, it could be done, but it would need to be the right people with the right script.
Tom Hanks cannot do this movie anymore. He could have done it in 1985. He cannot do this movie anymore.
No.
I will say I do agree with you that this movie does still have something to say that is important for now. I do agree with you on that. I don't know. I just have a hard time seeing the sincerity and the earnestness of this movie when so many it's hard to be anything but jaded about politics nowadays because it feels like corruption is not only more prevalent, it's more out in the open. And I think it's but I mean I do think there are some modern day people that you could use as inspiration for a character like Jefferson Smith, but it would be hard to get to the same level of sincerity and optimism about politics that this film does.
Out in the open, do you mean like being the president's son-in-law and then negotiating several different economic deals, and then when you're outside of the White House taking a significant grant from the Saudi Wealth Fund? That kind of corruption?
I don't know. I mean that's an example. I mean there's so many other ones you can go with.
Yeah. Nobody dared.
Anyway, as a historian, 1968 destroyed America's innocence, and 1974 with Watergate ripped anything that was left out of its heart with the beating still going on. Nothing has been the same since. You could do it, but you would have to make it much more swarmy and much more involved and intricate.
Again, the word is smarmy, not swarmy.
Okay.
And this is why people think you're rude.
All right. Any other remaining questions for anyone else?
I don't have any.
No? All right. So I want to thank both of our guests for being on with us. Sarah, you are now on, I think this is the 7th episode that you've been on to this point. But remind everybody again where you are and where people can find you.
Well, I am continuing to do research through both the Society for Military Historians, SMH, and AHA, as well as you can find me online posting about all of my historical trips and everything else I do at the Nomadic Archaeologist on Instagram.
And you will be back with us for, I believe, Knives Out in a couple of weeks. So we have that to look forward to. But also, thank you to you, Brian, and remind everybody again what you're working on and where people can find you.
Well, thank you very much for having me on again. It was an enjoyable conversation. I really appreciate it. You can find my work. My main hub is www.sonic-cinema.com. You can follow the podcast from there. You can follow my original music from there. You can read my reviews, read blogs that I come up with, as well as fan commentaries from several years ago if you so choose. But yeah, Sonic Cinema is the main hub where you can find my work.
Excellent. And we don't, unfortunately, have any time for final thoughts this week, so that'll do it for us. Thank you for listening. It's only after we've lost everything that we're free to do anything. Next week, for our 236th episode, we welcome back Andrew Corns of the Revisionist Almanac and Peterson W. Hill of the War Starts at Midnight podcast for a film we definitely can't talk about, Fight Club from 1999, for its 25th anniversary. Directed by David Fincher, written by Jim Yules. Music by the Dust Brothers, starring Brad Pitt, Edward Norton, Helena Bonham Carter, and Jared Leto. You won't want to miss that one, so watch ahead of the show by searching the Real Good app to find where it's streaming for you. That's REELGOOD. Please like, follow, rate, and review, or whatever on whichever platform you have so that more can join in our fun. You can also email the show at thenewryanstudios.com or at greatestaltimemoviepodcast@gmail.com, or find us on YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, Letterboxd, or TikTok at the handle @GModePodcast. The Greatest Movie of All Time is a production of Ryan Duncan Studios. Our show is mixed, edited, and written by Thomas Duncan. Our music is thanks to Purple Planet Music. Our technical provider and distributor is Captivate FM.